Okay, so when I'm going to be exploring the facial or buccal surface of the 4-6, to select the correct working end of the explorer, I would make sure that the terminal shank is parallel to the distal surface of the tooth. And to start exploring this tooth, I'd start at the distal line angle and then move into the distal interproximal space and then come out. And then I just flip the instrument and then start back at the distal line angle and move towards the mesial interproximal space. Okay, and now to explore the lingual surface of the 4-6, I would flip the instrument, so I'm using the opposite end of the instrument. And then again, I'd make sure that the terminal shank is parallel to the distal surface of the tooth, and I'd start at the distal line angle and move into the distal contact, and then I'd rotate it and go back to the distal line angle and go into the mesial interproximal space. Okay. The anterior tooth that I am going to be showing today is the 1-2. So before I would debride this tooth, I would go in with my explorer and just make sure that I feel for any deposit. So I'd start at the midline and go towards the mesial surface and then do the same thing, go back to the midline, I flip the instrument and then go towards and explore the distal surface of the tooth. And then I would do the same thing for the lingual surface. Okay. Starting at the midline and going towards the mesial, and then flipping the instrument and going towards the distal, starting at the midline again. Okay, and then once I've explored, I would go in with the H533 and I would go back to the midline of the tooth and then to remove the supragingival calculus deposit, I would just start at the midline and go towards the interproximal surface of the mesial. And then I would turn the instrument and then go back to the midline of the tooth and debride from the midline to the distal interproximal space. And then to do the lingual surface of the tooth, I would use my indirect vision and go back to the midline and go from the midline to the mesial interproximal space. And then I would flip the instrument and go from the midline again to the distal interproximal surface. And then to remove any of the subgingival calculus, I would use the 1314 Colombian universal scaler, and I would go at the midline of the tooth again, of the 1-2. I would close my angle on insertion, and then once I'm inserted, I would open my angle to between 60 and 80 degrees, and then I would use short oblique strokes when I'm moving into the mesial contact space. And then I'd close my angle again to remove the instrument. And then I would go in flipping the instrument and I'd go back to the midline of the tooth. I'd close the angle again, and then I'd open it once I've inserted to about 60 to 80 degrees, and then I'd move to the interproximal space of the distal surface of the 1-2. And then to the lingual surface of the tooth, I do the same thing. I'd go from the midline, I'd close my angle to insert, and then I'd open the angle, and then go towards the mesial surface. And then I'd flip the instrument and go from the midline again, close the angle to insert, open it, and then I would go to the distal surface. And then close the angle to remove the instrument. Okay, so when I'm debriding the distal surface of the 1/6 with the Gracie 1314 area-specific curette, to determine the correct working end, first of all, the terminal shank would be parallel to the distal surface of the tooth, and then I'm going to be using the lower working cutting edge. So to insert, I'm just going to insert at the distal surface, and then to make sure to know that the instrument is adapted to the tooth, the terminal shank would be parallel to the distal surface of the tooth. Okay, and then I would just remove the instrument and stop it. Okay, and now when I'm doing the lingual aspect of the 1/6 using the Gracie 1314 area-specific curette, again, the terminal shank would be parallel to the long axis or the distal surface of the tooth, and I'm going to be using the lower cutting edge. So I'm going to insert at the distal line angle. And then to make sure that I know that I'm adapted to the distal surface of the tooth, the terminal shank would be parallel to the distal surface of the tooth. And then I'd remove. Okay, so now I'm going to be using the S204S on the 2-4 on the facial or buccal aspect of the tooth. So to begin, I would make sure that I start at the distal line angle, and the terminal shank would be parallel to the distal surface of the tooth, and the functional shank would be up and over the tooth. So this is to remove the supragingival calculus, the S204S. So again, starting at the distal line angle, I'd use short vertical strokes on the distal aspect of the tooth, and then I'd just rotate the instrument and then go back to the distal line angle, do the facial surface, and then pivot and roll to the mesial surface of the tooth.